Nick, how are you?
Andy, I'm great. Thanks for the invite. Glad to be here with you today.
No, absolutely. For those who are just joining us, this is actually, Nick, our first episode of what we call the Goat Talks. We can get into later why we're actually calling it the Goat Talks, but I want to thank you for your time. I'm very, very excited. You and I have had a lot of discussions over the last few months, especially in the Atlassian community and the data protection and data classification space. But I want to really talk to you today and get to know a little bit more about your background, your expertise, and kind of the reasons that you're here with Opus Guard. We're going to dive in. We're going to have a ton of conversations, but I'm very excited about this. But Nick, for those who maybe are hearing about you for the first time, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. Thanks, Andy. So I'm Nick Wade, and I'm one of the co-founders and the COO here at Opus Guard. And we are a smallish startup that's relatively new, focused essentially on information governance in our modern SaaS application world. And so we help our customers deal with retention of information across the SaaS tools that they're using. And this is kind of a difficult problem today when all of your applications were, on premise and behind the firewall, you had absolute control of everything that lived in them and for how long and where data protection copies of those things might go. As you know, Andy, it's a different story in the SaaS world, and the tooling for these kinds of questions is pretty sparse and standalone per tool. And so our job is to present customers with essentially a single pane of glass by which they can manage retention policy across all their content over time and all the way through to end of life and handle the actions that are required for them at that point.
Nick, I think it's been when you look at what you and the team at Opus Guard is doing, it's awesome. Now the question is, how did you get to this point, right? I know you've been with organizations like Okta and Atlassian. How does one get to the point where you have this very specific field where you guys are doing a great job of addressing?
Yeah, well, you can probably tell I'm not the youngest of, startup founders, right? So you see here, I have some, let's call it wisdom. And that just simply means that long years of experience and sort of recognizing patterns of things that have happened over time, as part of companies, right? So you're right. I have spent time at Okta. That was through an acquisition of Auth0. I was with Auth0. I've spent time in a cloud infrastructure provider, DigitalOcean. I've spent time at Atlassian, quite a few years at Atlassian. And even prior to that, I was actually in product management, leading product management for e-discovery and compliance products, which is a weird, neat sort of connecting thread back to what we're doing here today with information governance, right? E-discovery and compliance is very much at the heart of it. And I have, along with my co-founders, recognized a pattern that's occurred many times where old information surfaced in some context and confused, the answer to a question that you're seeking, or became very apparent very quickly that it's out of compliance with an organization's retention policy. And those might actually even be regulatory in nature, let alone just like, the internal policies for best practice information governance. And so that's happened many times in security contexts, in information management contexts, you name it. Old information turned up that shouldn't have been there. And we're just like, okay, there's a problem now as we migrate all of our usage of application tooling across to SaaS tools that we rent from someone else. How do we handle the deletion and, eventual kind of audit trail of those management actions of information that we create day to day? There isn't a great answer. And so that's how we sort of recognized unpacking parts of that problem, that there's regulatory aspects, there's industry frameworks that require you to follow your retention policy now in your unstructured information, right? It's not just the stuff in your database that needs to be PCI compliant. It's kind of everything. And so that's why we started Opus Guard. We believe that people are going to want to manage the life cycle and retention of all the content they're creating in their SaaS tools increasingly in the coming years.
Nick, don't worry, I am joining you very soon. I'm already starting to count the gray hairs, so I'll be over there very quickly. So maybe next time we chat, I'll look like Steve Martin back in the day. So we'll see how that goes. But Nick, to your point, because you mentioned SaaS, and I want to walk through how does this actually happen, because we meet organizations all the time that are maybe not fully aware of their SaaS tooling and their SaaS data.
Yeah.
What's your approach with somebody like that who says, we have Microsoft 365, we have Salesforce. These are the things that we spend a lot of money, but we both know there's so many more workloads out there. How do you have a conversation with somebody, get them to really understand the scope first of not only the breadth of SaaS workloads that they have, but also the depth of that data?
Yeah, it's really interesting. There's multiple sources of research, and these are primarily, survey research that drives some level of quantitative interpretation from various parties out there, and they result in the following kind of statistics, right? Small and medium businesses tend to have about 150 different SaaS tools in play internally at any given time. And then up from there, up towards, enterprise class organizations, they tend to have about 350, maybe even more. And this is related to a few things. One is kind of shadow IT. SaaS tools include our use, for example, of like signing up to ChatGPT with a work email address as the account. And so you can imagine how every team just doing a few extra things for themselves then kind of multiplies across the organization and results in this picture. And so the first thing is like, in terms of governance, right, getting a handle on all of the SaaS tooling that your organization is actually touching, determining if it's valid and relevant, and talking to the owners of that SaaS tool. And when you do an audit, you'll find like more than you think that you will. And so the problem is, on a few fronts. One is the tooling, is the application secure? Is it compliant with the standards that you're trying to follow, and the regulations that you face? Has the team put it through procurement and approval, or is someone paying for it, out of pocket with a credit card, even a corporate credit card? And so lots of these things happen, and we tend to talk to people about just the breadth and the scale of these moving swiftly throughout their organization and kind of creating these information governance problems for later that they're somewhat unaware of in many cases. So we just have that discussion. Have you done an audit? What did you find? And what are you doing for cloud governance? How are you governing which applications employees actually use and feed your organizational data into?
That makes a lot of sense, Nick. And a lot of folks, I think it takes them a while to get to that point, especially that first knee jerk reaction is to only assume a couple of these workloads. But then let's say that people do have a good assumption. Where have you found a lot of the mythology that builds up in SaaS where people just assume the vendor is responsible, right? Even in the context of compliance, like how have you seen that play out? And most importantly, why do you think that happens? These are incredibly talented, incredibly accomplished people in CIOs and CISOs. Why does this mythology exist?
Yeah, you see it as a data protection provider as well. I rent the SaaS application from someone, and they take care of everything, right? It's backed up. So if I have a problem, they can restore it for me. Well, the answer is, typically that backups that are done by a SaaS app provider are for their site level disaster recovery and business continuity. So like say, some AWS site that they're using goes down, sure, they can recover. But their objective in terms of like recovery time and like object level recovery for you just doesn't really exist. And it's the same thing with data retention and management. That's all up to you. The SaaS vendor is not helping you be compliant with the regulations that you have to follow or with the industry standard frameworks. They may give you some basic tooling, but I think that in a lot of cases, mythology results from sort of being early in the cloud transformation and needing to really understand which problems to look at next. Information retention and information governance, data retention and information governance is kind of like the next one. And so we're going to see a lot of that over the next 5 years.
Now, you actually already mentioned this as well, and native tooling is always it's always interesting because, there's several steps you have to take in order to finally take responsibility for your data, build a plan of action, right? And it goes from, hey, I'm actually responsible for this to, okay, I am responsible for this. Now, what do I do? And a lot of folks assume and expect that the vendor is going to provide them the tooling that is good enough, right? And we see that across every workload. What does that dynamic look like, especially when an organization, especially somebody with very serious information governance requirements, where does some of that tooling fall short?
Yeah, so what we have found is that tooling falls short in that it typically is a parochially focused set of tools. So take Atlassian, for example. Their products today have some basic content management tools. There's the content manager in Confluence and the site optimizer in Jira. But those things are designed to just kind of surveil what information is out there and allow an administrator to take manual action on lifecycle. But it doesn't really fit within a broader perspective of data protection and data retention across the org. So let's say you're using Purview, right? You've also got M365 and you have Purview and you've set up policies for information retention there. Like, how does that work across the rest of the SaaS apps you've got? It's really difficult. And, the same is true for data protection. And so our objective, our strategy is to provide that one layer where we orchestrate all information retention, regardless of the policy source. And so obviously, early in our journey, we build policy sources ourselves directly. Our next couple of steps are likely to include building policy sources from somewhere else like Purview and potentially Google Vault and other things like that. The reality is there's just no centralization of control of these things. And so legal ops and GRC teams are really struggling to understand what policy applies for data protection, what policy applies for data retention, where it's being affected, how it's happening, where the audit trails are, how they demonstrate defensible deletion, how they demonstrate to auditors that they're actually doing the ISO 27001, management of retention across unstructured data. Like that's very hard to do in a central way. And so that's what we aim to provide.
Nick, that makes sense. I actually want to dive into that a little bit more because, we actually, let's assume that neither of us exist in this space. And when you look at how an organization had to manage information governance on-prem, right, monolithic systems, uniform workloads, all of a sudden SaaS applications are the de facto consumption
Yep.
model for
Yeah.
technology. What does that look like? And how do you go, what does that actually look like for somebody who's responsible for information governance to go from, hey, everything's sitting on a VM and a physical machine, databases that I have everything in one place in a uniform approach to crap, I have everything absolutely everywhere. And what do I do? Like, how challenging is that? And can you kind of like put a little color to what that looks like in the day to day of somebody responsible for this?
Yeah, sure. I'll do my best. We know it is quite challenging because the things that you could build internally in order to manage this stuff, right? Data protection strategies, data retention strategies, and the tools that are required in order to get there, they're 100% within your control, and you would have application developer teams who'd be focused on these infrastructure level problems. In the SaaS application world, it's basically down to a vendor's API set and what they're willing to give you in terms of control. And it can be highly varied. If we just look at Atlassian's applications, everything that allows you to control the information in the teamwork graph in terms of what's in Jira and Confluence is pretty complete. Everything in Loom is essentially absent, and that is a very big new Atlassian application that stores recordings of meetings, including people's likenesses, their voice prints, and everything that they ever said for some amount of time that has this like high-level singular policy inside of Loom. And that's just one tiny example. We find typically that enterprise-level SaaS has a better set of APIs for controls, and sometimes some of these standalone tools with simple policy types of implementations, and sometimes they don't. So the first problem we touched on earlier, a CISO, a CIO, understanding how many applications they're actually using and where their information's going and who the data processors are and the sub-processors and where it's resident and all those cool questions about basic compliance. The second thing is then, how do I manage it? Is it up to the people that create it to become the determining sort of record decision maker? And if that's the case, then does it live in that system as a system of record, or does it have to be moved somewhere? Like, these are the stages that everyone's at. And what we see is that many organizations default to making the employee the decision maker for everything. And that leaves you fraught with room for human error or just human frailties of like not wanting to do it. Like, my job isn't managing this page or this thing in DocuSign. My job is to like get the DocuSigns done so I get deals in the door. Why should I be managing their life cycle? You know what I mean? And so those are some of the complexities that I think organizations are facing. It's just a big map. How you manage it is highly variable, and there's no central way to do it.
That's actually, I want to double click on that because this is something that we've observed as well, which is IT teams tend to standardize and, they had standard workloads that they could standardize, but the application owner kind of is the boss now. They're the ones who choose the use case that makes sense for them. You mentioned that it's a challenge and they might not care, or they might be really focused on, hey, I own the sales tech or the MarTech. Like, this is not my problem. I have so many other things to do. What do you think should be the right thing? Like, who do you think actually should be owning information governance in this app owner SaaS consumption world?
That is a challenging open question that I don't think we as an industry have answered yet. So one thing I'll say is in highly regulated industries, there are some standard answers for this, right? There are people who are charged with the business of records management inside of financial institutions, for example, and there's very careful examination of which bits of information fit into which categories, they get classified, and they get given a life cycle as a result. Now, as those institutions move to the SaaS world, they're encountering all the same problems that the rest of us do. The rest of us, I see, as I think I just touched on, highly variable answers depending on who the organization is. A lot of the time today, the answer is you as an end user and as an employee are going to be given a records or a document policy. It's up to you to figure out this thing represents something that should be in a system of record. All the rest of this is like busy work and meeting notes and so forth that don't need to be retained. And today there is, just no single central answer. Ultimately, though, if you're asking the question about who's responsible for laying out the policy, it's a combination of legal, determining, what the retention policy for the organization needs to look like, GRC, making sure that aligns with any regulatory and other sort of risk-related requirements and compliance with both regulations and standards that your company says. Like, I'll give you a simple example. If you are ISO 27001 certified and you are not doing data retention management across all the info in your SaaS tools and your auditors catch it, you are at risk of losing your ISO 27001 at this point. Those penalties came into effect last year in 2024. It just hasn't happened in tremendous volume yet because I think they recognize that organizations are struggling to get there. And so that's why, we created Opus Guard to try and help them centralize that and get there.
Nick, do you find that compliance mandates, whether it's healthcare or things like DORA, have they caught up with where data sits today, or do you think there's still a ways to go?
Yeah, no, they haven't caught up. Not yet, but it's coming. They will catch up eventually. And, audits and regulatory oversight will catch up. I think that regulatory oversight tends to have more wherewithal now. And that's why financial organizations subject to DORA, for example, are pretty cautious in their approach and they want to be competent because they don't want to lose their accreditation and risk the reputation of their entire business. The rest of us, has the problem ever happened yet? No, not yet. We'll just leave it. It's coming. It is absolutely coming for everyone. But no, it hasn't caught up yet.
Right as it catches up, though, Nick, to quote other folks, right, we're going to enter a fast fashion of SaaS applications where internal teams are building their own systems, which is going to add even more complexity. Nick, let's talk about AI because I think everyone is contractually mandated to. But the reason I want to bring this up is in information governance, you have very specific use cases that are decades old, right? PCI, PII, what kind of data, healthcare data, consumer data. But things are getting a little weirder. There's more data at play. There's more use cases. What's the role of information governance of what you're doing within AI, and why does that matter even to the business?
Right. So let's talk about AI from a very simplistic perspective first. The kinds of AI tools that we're turning on in an enterprise context today include things like Glean and Atlassian Rovo and some other similar tooling. And they are very adept at going out and finding everything, indexing it, and using everything that they find as essentially training data on all organizational knowledge for the LLM that you're now about to use to ask it questions. And so what you find in a lot of AI projects, and pilots that are happening internally today is that most of them are not generating any reasonable return on investment. The two things that they're doing is adding a little bit of like speed up the work of summarize this email and prepare me for the next meeting versus anything transformational, not there yet. And the second thing they're doing is turning up all sorts of old skeletons in closets that really ought not to be there because they're very, very adept at doing this. Now, an LLM will take that old information and mix it in with newer information and produce it as if it is perfect, as if it is, factual and accurate. Our current generation of LLMs are not designed to say to you, I'm not so sure about this answer that I'm giving you. It's designed to say, this is the correct answer, here it is. And you've probably had personal interactions with, ChatGPT or whatever that have made that very clear to you, as I have. Well, that's happening in the business context as well. So the old policy for whatever it is, travel and expenses, turns up telling you that it's okay to spend X amount of money, per diem, but actually that limit has changed. Or the old price list turns up because it was in a PDF somewhere that got indexed or whatever, right? The wrong answer in a support context. Like we're all seeing agentic support workflows as the starting point for where a lot of AI projects are occurring. And they're just coming up with information that frequently is non-relevant to, the problem that your customer is experiencing. So those are things that we see happening a lot with AI today. And it feels to me as if it's very much in its infancy in terms of deploying actual high quality, transformative workflow interactions that really speed the business along. One of the, answers is like, okay, the old stuff just shouldn't be there. There are more answers that are needed for AI to be really useful. Another part of it is like agents that understand the context really cleanly, because there are some use cases where super old information should be blended. And then there are some use cases where that super old information should not be blended into the answer. So it's really interesting and challenging and kind of fun time to be at work on these kinds of problems.
Humility has not been embedded into the models yet. I
Not
think
yet.
that's yet is the operating word, and that's a whole other podcast discussion. But this concept of data hygiene is critical, right? Because one of the things that we've noticed, anytime anybody deploys, especially for the first time in an organization, some form of LLM or Gen AI use case, trust is huge. And whether it gives you the wrong data or gives you old data, you potentially have lost users and utility for good, right? So that role of data hygiene is very critical. I want you to walk me through a little bit more specifically into this, because let's say that our organization has massive amount of data in Confluence, right? Even because I know exactly, things that you're building that could be of benefit. Like what does Opus Guard do in that context, right? We have a Confluence instance that's 15 years old, right? The world's data, the entire neurological system of an organization is in Confluence. How do you approach that? How do you make sure that that data is compliant, accessible, and hygienic?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the question is about how we approach, for example, a system like Confluence where there's loads of pages, blog posts, diagrams, charts, you name it, that have been built up over years and years. The first kind of default mode of thinking of a lot of organizations is this is how we did business, it's how we made decisions, and it's all valuable. The reality is that some of those things, there's a percentage of them that are valuable to explain how we made decisions about certain projects, how we built certain products. The rest of it is usually a lot of busy work, and stuff that just doesn't need to be there, but also stuff that actually exceeds the retention policy of the organization. Now, it's very unusual to find retention policies for anything other than super long-lived products. So like automotive industry, for example, they have products that can live for decades. And so they may have retention policies that relate to similar periods of time. But the rest of us, we're building like, I don't know, a bit of software that came out in 2007, got sunsetted in 2017. It had a decade lifespan, and it doesn't need to be there in 2025 or 2026 because regulatory kind of oversight would suggest that you keep product documentation for product lifecycle plus 7 years. So how do we approach that in a system like Confluence? You first have to have an inventory, a constant real-time inventory of every bit of information in the system. And so that's what we do. We're constantly scanning every piece of information and understanding its life, meaning when it was created and when it was last modified, and even to some extent, whether or not it's active in terms of viewership, right? The analytics that Confluence can provide you. The second thing is then you map the organization's retention policies across all of that. And so we provide tooling in Opus Guard's applications to do that. And it's not super easy, especially in a large organization. And so you tend to want to have groups of people who are designated as managers of this stuff because they might understand finance documents. And so you'd have 3 or 4 people in the group for, finance, retention management. Others might understand engineering project documentation. Others might understand legal documentation. And so you would want to designate groups of people who can then say, these are the retention policies that we need to use. And they tend to be, 3 years, 5 years, 6, 7, 10, and so on. These are the data classifications, which are an intersecting sort of dynamic way of managing, whether something's, internal, sensitive or restricted or whatever. And they often also imply a retention policy. And then a rule set, we allow users to create rules, these retention managers across all their content that results in, here's a map of stuff. These are the cycles that they're going through. This is coming up for expiry soon, and then we obviously build routines to go delete it when it's necessary. So that's how we approach it. It's that was a sort of product-centric answer, but it is actually the same sort of answer for retention policy everywhere, right? Ultimately, information has to be classified and tagged with a life cycle, and then it has to follow through with that life cycle unless somebody determines, nope, that life cycle is wrong and we need to tag it differently. That's how it works. It's fundamentally a very simple premise. It's just practically a pretty complex thing to implement.
And contextual, right?
Yeah.
Which is and the API dance that we all have to do, right, with every single vendor and what's available there. Question for you here too, because this is my opinion, you can tell me if I'm wrong, because we've experienced something very similar in the data protection space where it's a much more difficult job, more time consuming. The FTEs, the tooling, the context is needed is way, way beyond what an organization that was primarily on premises was leveraging. What does the future look like on the information governance side? 5 years from now, when SaaS and cloud, people are running production systems in cloud, business applications are all SaaS, there are no more old Exchange servers on prem. What does that role look like? Is it 5 times larger of a department? Is it the tooling that's going to automate all of it? What does that look like?
The big problem in information governance today is essentially one of classifiers, understanding the information that you have and then using classification decisions to apply the correct management of it. And that management can be security, visibility, shareability, retention and lifecycle, protection, and decisions there, as you well know. So 5 years from now, our view is that there will be tooling built by companies like Opus Guard and to some extent built by larger SaaS providers, including Microsoft, Atlassian, Google, and others. And those bits of tooling will help organizations understand where information should live, how it should be secured, if it's shared externally or not, how it gets protected, how many copies in which locations, right? Music to your ears, and whether or not it should be deleted at X point in time, and if that deletion needs to be assured and guaranteed, or if it's just routine kind of, basic cleanup. And then the last point is going to be, how does it get used in the context of AI workflows and whether or not it's included in some answer? And I think that on some level, old stuff, obviously that's one step. Just get rid of it because it's past its retention policy. That's what we do today. There's another level where should it be included in the LLM's training set if the LLM is focused on generating support answers for customers? At some stage, support documentation for long dead products shouldn't be included. And so there's a system of control of, what goes into the training set. And then there's a system of filtering in the agentic sort of instructions that result in an answer. So my view is that, those two things will have to emerge. There will be central layers of control and there'll be classifiers that work well at scale to help organizations understand all of these decisions. And we'll be orchestrating these things, together for data protection, for data retention, and for other aspects of information governance. Obviously, protection and retention are just two. There's many more that result in compliance and security posture and all of that other stuff.
Nick, what you described makes total sense. Sounds like an entirely different set of skills and experiences for the people responsible for this. If you're having a conversation with somebody today in the information governance space, maybe they come in from legacy technology stack and the systems are rapidly modernizing because we're now seeing that. What advice do you have for them? New skill sets? How do they future proof and how do they become super effective? Because they may have become even more important than they already were.
Two pieces of advice that we start with. One is start small. You don't have to solve the entire problem immediately, but if you're not undertaking any efforts, you may be doing the wrong thing or missing an opportunity. The second is just assess the problem to begin with so that you start to get an understanding of it. So let's talk about data retention for 1 second. We built a version of Opus Guard's applications. They're called Content Retention Manager that are read-only and have no write and no delete permissions in the systems of SaaS that they connect to. And the reason we did that is because what we fundamentally do has some risk and some fear associated with deleting everything that you care about and potentially making it unrecoverable. Now, I would advise that they have HYCU so that it could be recoverable if accidents occur, but there's some fear, and it's healthy fear associated with installing a tool that fundamentally is designed to delete and purge information from the system so it can't be found in legal discovery or audits, right? And so you can actually install that free version of our applications to just assess what the content picture looks like across your systems and start to model policies in small ways on, say, older spaces and project information, or maybe even high value spaces and project information. And in fact, they're all spaces now. Jira just renamed everything to be a space. You can start small, and you can start with just assessing. And we even built some tooling to help you do that without having to invest anything other than time to begin to understand the picture. So that's our key advice always. Start small, assess the problem first, and then start having discussions about whether or not things are out of compliance. And if you are at the point that you are ready to do something about it. Not every organization is. Many are, but in order to do that, they're going to have to prioritize some internal investments and actions.
Nick, when you say many are, though, obviously you've just come from Atlassian teams in Barcelona. We all know the big news, Atlassian data center.
Yep.
There are so many decisions that you have to make now as somebody responsible for that migration as a customer. Data classification has to be embedded into that as well. For those who maybe are already having to evaluate that, they're building out their checklists, they're becoming aware of the shared responsibility model. How do they get in touch with Opus Guard? How do they reach you?
Yeah, look, it's easy. So let's talk about data center transformation and migration for 1 second. Some customers may be upset with the future that they face and kind of assess different alternatives, but I think many customers are going to realize that the right thing to do, the cost-effective thing to do, the most efficient thing to do is to migrate to Atlassian's SaaS applications in the cloud. It means that they can continue working in the same ways that they have before with familiar tooling, but now Atlassian obviously manages a lot of it. So there are 2 or 3 things that we typically see and also advise customers. And by the way, frequently this is through the bigger solution partners, right? And it may be the same for you at HYCU. The first one is that in the migration from data center across to the cloud, do you need to take everything? Or is some of it feasible for leaving behind in some kind of form of archival system that can be queried if it needs to be retained so that it can be fetched easily in future? The second thing is if you take everything, you're going to have a very big cloud instance, which the performance of them starts to suffer and degrade a bit if you just keep 20-year-old everything. And I know for a fact that in enterprises that we're talking to, there are millions and like tens of millions of Jira work items and tens of millions of Confluence pieces of content that are going to drag system performance down and infect Rovo with incredibly old information. So you tend to see data protection and data retention concerns emerge immediately after the migration is done. And so our advice is engage with the people who can help you solve those questions and start to ensure that all the information is protected in ways that it needs to be, and you're slimming it down as much as you can in a way that's compliant with your retention policy. And in that way, you actually also slim down data protection as well, right? The object storage that keeps a copy of everything can get smaller, and the second copy of it gets smaller again. So there's this power law in effects of efficiency across the board.
Nick, that's, what we can create an episode of Hoarders where some of the instances that we run into that are no joke petabytes of data within an instance, because this is the historical collection of all assets and knowledge within a company. Easier said than done. That you need a lot of that context in order to perform that exercise. But I can't agree with you more. The more efficient that you go to the cloud, the better it will be, especially if Rovo is a primary driver of those use cases. Now, Nick, I've had an incredible conversation. What you're doing at Opus Guard, what the team is doing is incredible. But I have one final kind of surprising and provocative question for you. A lot of the times when you have conversations with people, everyone's talking about the same trends. Everyone has an opinion. These are certain buzzwords that we all have to acknowledge and collect. Can you give me potentially a contrarian opinion where everyone might disagree with you in this technology world that we live in? And I'll give you a couple seconds to think about it, but is there a contrarian opinion that you have within today's ecosystem?
That is a provocative question. I don't know if I've got a great answer for you, Andy. What I would say about AI systems is not contrarian, right? They're going to feed off each other, and eventually the world will be full of AI information feeding other AI systems, right? And I don't know how we're going to deal with that. We'll have to do something. Maybe the contrarian opinion is that what we do is fundamentally actually very simple in nature and doesn't need a ton of AI investment. You need to understand where information lives and why, and apply simplistic rules in nature. They can be imperative in order to determine how long it lives there and when to get rid of it. This doesn't require AI technology. We do offer AI variants, right? There's an AI powered content classification agent that helps you determine if something should be internal or restricted or public or whatever, but you don't need it. And maybe that's a contrarian opinion because everything right now is all about AI. And we're saying, actually, you don't need it for this problem that we solve. And in fact, we make your AI better by solving it with simple technology at heart.
Nick, I would say that, you know, folks with deep AI investments, that is contrarian. So I salute you and I congratulate you for that. I actually think that was a great answer. Nick, thank you so much. For those who are listening today, what the team is doing on Opus Guard, you can find them on the Atlassian Marketplace or find their website as well. Nick, thank you so much, and I hope you have a great day.
Thank you, Andy. Again, really appreciate the invite and interesting, provocative conversation and great questions. All the best.
Thanks, Nick.